Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really persistent question. The U.S. relationship with Pakistan, and specifically all that financial aid. Billions over the years. What's actually been the result?
And to help us unpack this pretty complex issue, we're looking at Christine Fair's work. She's a security studies expert, knows the region inside out, Georgetown, RAND, the UN. She's got the credentials.
Yeah, definitely. And her perspective is often quite critical, which is exactly what we need.
Right.
So our mission today is to kind of cut through the diplomatic speak, get to the heart of what this U.S. aid has really meant based on Fair's analysis. What are the consequences? And maybe is there a better way forward?
Exactly. And it helps to remember some context we've touched on before from Fair's research.
Right, like the whole civil military thing in Pakistan, how the military's influence really shapes their foreign policy, especially towards India and, crucially, Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that connects to her work on Pakistan using non-state actors, militant groups, basically, as a foreign policy tool.
Which led to that really stark argument we discussed that the U.S. partnership with Pakistan actually, hindered U.S. goals in Afghanistan because their interests just weren't aligned.
And she's also pushed thinking towards, other relationships for the U.S. in the region, looking at Iran, India, how China fits in, even raising some, let's say, unconventional ideas about Kashmir.
Okay, so keeping all that background in mind, here's the big puzzle. If Pakistan has, seemingly undermined U.S. interests so often, bin Laden found near their top military academy alleged support for groups attacking U.S. troops like Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Right.
Why does the aid, roughly $30 billion we're talking about, keep flowing? Why hasn't it just stopped?
That is the absolute core of the problem Fair dives into. And the standard answer you get, maybe from the State Department or U.S. State, it's always about access. We need access, so the aid is strategically necessary.
But Fair just doesn't buy that, does she?
Not really. She looks at the evidence and says, look, despite these billions, Pakistan has consistently acted in ways that go against U.S. goals. So this idea that the money buys leverage or guarantees cooperation, her work suggests it just doesn't stack up. And then there's the nuclear factor that looms large.
Oh, absolutely. Pakistan's growing nuclear arsenal. Fair really emphasizes this, especially the tactical nukes, the smaller battlefield ones.
Yeah, those are particularly worrying because they lower the threshold for use, potentially. It's a huge concern for the U.S., and it definitely shapes the aid conversation.
And Fair's point, as I understand it, is that Pakistan developed these partly to deter India, sure, but also to deter the U.S. from cutting off aid. Is that right?
That's a key part of her argument. It's like a form of leverage. Keep the support coming, or things could get very dangerous. It creates this difficult dynamic for U.S. policymakers.
So the aid, the F-16s, help with the IMF loans. Direct cash Fair argues it's essentially enabling this whole system. A military-dominated state relying on nuclear threats and those jihadist proxies we mentioned.
Precisely. She sees it as fueling a system that resists fundamental change, a system that's actually counterproductive to long-term stability and maybe even U.S. interests.
Which brings us to something really alarming. She raises the vulnerability of those nuclear weapons, and apparently she's more worried now than she used to be.
Yes, that's a significant shift, she notes in her own thinking. She used to think, perhaps a decade ago, that, worst-case external powers could probably secure the weapons if extremists got close. She felt U.S. and Pakistani interests in just keeping them safe were aligned enough.
But not anymore.
Not so much. And she makes a really potent point by bringing up U.S. nuclear safety lapses. Remember that incident in 2007? Nuclear warheads accidentally flown across the U.S.?
Right, I remember that.
Her point is, if the U.S. with all its resources can have mishaps like that, imagine the risks in Pakistan, given the internal challenges and threats they face. It makes you think.
So what are the specific vulnerabilities she points to in Pakistan?
Well, two main things. First, the sheer amount of movement. They apparently move the weapons and materials around frequently, supposedly for security, to keep them hidden. But all that movement just increases the risk. More chances for an accident or theft.
Okay, that makes sense. More moving parts, more risk.
Exactly. And second, and maybe even more concerning, is infiltration. The possibility of extremists or sympathizers within the military and intelligence services. There have been successful attacks on heavily guarded bases in Pakistan over the years.
Attacks that suggest maybe they had help from the inside.
That's the implication, or at least a major worry Fair highlights. And these risks, she argues, they just skyrocket during a crisis. Imagine an India-Pakistan conflict escalating and tactical nukes potentially being deployed or moved rapidly. The chances for something catastrophic to happen. Well, it's deeply concerning.
So the aid, in this view, isn't just maybe ineffective, it could be contributing to this really dangerous situation.
That's the core of her warning, yes. And it's not just about the direct U.S. bilateral aid either. She broadens the lens to include the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Ah, right, because Pakistan relies heavily on IMF bailouts, too.
Very heavily. And FAIR describes this pattern, this cycle. Pakistan needs money, they go to the IMF, they promise reforms like, actually getting more people to pay taxes, widening the tax base. They get the loan tranche, but then the reforms don't really happen, or they get rolled back. And sooner or later, they're back at the IMF's door asking for more.
And the U.S. role in this?
Well, the U.S. has significant influence at the IMF. FAIR argues that the U.S. has, perhaps unintentionally, enabled this cycle by supporting these bailouts without ensuring the reforms actually stick. It allows Pakistan to sort of muddle through without making tough choices.
Which leads to her description of Pakistan as a rentier state?
Exactly. A rentier state, meaning the elites, both military and political, rely more on external income, like foreign aid or IMF loans, which she calls rents, than on building a productive economy and taxing their own population.
So they're not really accountable to their own people in the same way?
That's the consequence. If the government doesn't depend on its citizens for revenue through taxes, it has less incentive to be responsive to their needs. FAIR notes that, civilian leaders are theoretically accountable through elections, flawed as they might be, but the military operates largely outside even that check. The aid props up this whole structure.
And it undermines democracy because everything becomes about personal connections, elite networks, getting access to that external funding, not about broad-based development or citizen demands.
Precisely. Ordinary citizens get left out. Their influence is minimal. Access depends on patronage, not policy.
Okay, so given all this pretty damning analysis, what's FAIR's solution? What does she propose?
It's blunt and controversial, no doubt. She argues the U.S. and the IMF need to cut off the aid. Stop the flow of funds.
Wow. Just cut it off. What would happen then? I mean, she must acknowledge the potential fallout.
Oh, absolutely. She's realistic. She predicts that in the short term, it would likely be painful. The military would still demand its huge share of the budget, probably, and the government might impose more regressive taxes, like sales taxes, that hit ordinary people hardest initially.
So it wouldn't be an easy fix.
No, definitely not presented as one. But she argues it's necessary tough love for the long run. Without that external cushion, the government would finally be forced to make fundamental changes. They have to figure out how to actually collect taxes from elites, reform fiscal policy, build a sustainable domestic economy.
And the connection there is taxation leads to representation, or at least accountability.
That's the historical link she's drawing on. When citizens pay significant taxes, they start demanding a say in how that money is spent. They want results. They hold the government accountable. It's a stark contrast, she suggests, to places like, say, Saudi Arabia, where oil revenue means the government doesn't need to tax much and responsiveness suffers.
So forcing Pakistan onto a path of building a real tax system could, over time, shift power away from the military and towards maybe a more empowered parliament and citizenry.
That's the potential long-term benefit she envisions. If Parliament actually controlled meaningful purse strings derived from domestic taxes, they might have more leverage to question military budgets, demand oversight, and build more robust democratic institutions.
So her argument isn't punitive, it's pragmatic, trying to break a cycle that she sees as dangerous and ultimately unsustainable.
Exactly. It's about realism. Removing the external props to force internal accountability and, hopefully, push Pakistan towards greater self-reliance and genuine reform.
It really puts the whole aid debate in a different light. FAIR's analysis suggests the continued flow of U.S. money isn't just failing to achieve U.S. goals. It might actually be, propping up a system with some really dangerous elements of the nuclear risks, the militant proxies, and preventing Pakistan from developing in a more stable, accountable way.
Yeah, the powerful critique. Which leaves us with a really challenging thought, doesn't it? If continuing aid as usual has these deep problems, and just cutting it off has its own risks and uncertainties, what other options are there? What kind of relationship can the U.S. realistically build with a nuclear-armed Pakistan, considering this history?
That's the question to ponder. There are no easy answers here. We definitely encourage you to look more into Christine Fair's work. It's complex, but really important for understanding this critical part of the world.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.